Greetings, welcome to the Citizen Exclusive with Mpoki Thompson. As always, we have prepared an interesting episode today. This is a farewell episode. I'm at the residence of the British High Commissioner to Tanzania, Mr. David Concar. David Concar assumed his role in 2020, 2024. His role has come to an end. David, welcome to the Citizen Exclusive.
Thank you. Great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Indeed, this is about, I think, the third time that I get the opportunity to interview you. Unfortunately, this might be the last time that we ever get the privilege of having this conversation. You've spent 4 years here in Tanzania. A lot has happened during that entire tenure. I want us, today's conversation is going to focus basically on what you have been able to achieve, but how British-Tanzania relations continue to evolve over the years. When you came in August 2020, there were certain objectives, certain agendas that you were supposed to implement during your tenure. To begin off, just give us a bit of a highlight of what you have been able to achieve during the entire 4 years that you spent in Tanzania. And as you answer that, you can also talk about some of the challenges that you've encountered. Karibu.
Okay, well, look, thank you for inviting me for another interview. It is our third time, so thank you very much. Well, I arrived in Tanzania in 2020, August 2020. So I had, some of my early priorities were pretty clear. So number one, the pandemic, the global pandemic was going on. So my first priority really was the safety and welfare of my staff, including my Tanzanian national staff in Dar es Salaam. Second priority was British nationals doing business here, many of them in the tourism sector, going through a very, very tough time because of COVID. I mean, we know that the whole tourism industry really hit a very tough period at that point. So being ready to support them was a priority. Thirdly, it was August 2020. That's just 2 or 3 months out from the 2020 elections in Tanzania in October of that year. So getting the British High Commission ready and prepared for those elections. We were accredited to be official observers of the elections, so it was really important for me that we were able to exercise that status, if you like, well and responsibly. And then the fourth major priority was in 2 areas, climate change and economic development. And I could see, I knew on arrival, in fact, even before I got here, that Tanzania was a really, really important country in terms of UK's future cooperation on climate change. You have these huge forests which act as a carbon sink, but at the same time, Tanzania has a lot of development to do and has a lot of vulnerability to climate change, so it would need to adapt and be able to access climate financing internationally to do that. And then on the economic side, the UK, I knew before I came here, was already one of the second largest cumulative investor in the country in terms of foreign direct investment. So I wanted us to, build on that and be ready to further expand our investment in Tanzania and to, increase trade, bilateral trade. So those are my sort of 4 priorities coming in. In terms of how do we do on those? In terms of keeping staff safe, including my Tanzanian staff, yes, we did. We succeeded on that during the pandemic. In terms of British nationals, particularly those doing tourism business here, most of them came through remarkably well and showed great, resilience throughout and beyond the pandemic. On the 2020 elections, I'm glad to say we did exercise our responsibility. We did observe the elections. We did send in our report afterwards. And then on climate change and growing the economic relationship, bilateral relationship, yes, we've made great strides on that. We are now doing a lot more with Tanzania on climate change. We partnered and supported Tanzania very well, I think, on COP26. That was the start then of increased cooperation in that space, which continues now. We're now looking at bringing in more programs in climate change and clean energy, supporting Dar es Salaam to develop sustainable waste and climate resilient waste disposal systems. And on the economic side, we held the first ever UK Tanzania bilateral Trade and Investment Forum. Our trade envoy through that period made repeated visits, and we have overseen a number of expanded or new investments from the UK into Tanzania. So I think I don't want to mark my homework too positively, but I think overall I feel that on the key objectives we did achieve really what we set out to.
Okay, it's interesting that you've talked about, we're going to touch a little bit about the economic scale, specifically if you've got any figures in terms of the investments that have been directed to Tanzania. Let's talk about the election now. We understand that the 2020 election, by and large, when you talk to many of the people here in Tanzania, but also the international community, it was a contentious election. You say that the British government was an observer. What is your view in terms of the outcome of the 2020 general election? And so from the government perspective, the ruling party, CCM, says that it was a fair and free election. But there has been a lot of criticism regarding the 2020 election. What is your view? What is your opinion on that?
Well, it's as a diplomat, and you get to observe elections, the main deal there is, you're given a status to observe, and then you file your report to the government of Tanzania afterwards, to the Electoral Commission, to be specific afterwards, and they then get to see the details of what you saw on the ground and what your teams in different parts of the country saw, and the sort of protocol around this is that you don't, as a diplomat, then take all of that information into the public domain. You give it to the Electoral Commission so that they can then act on that information as and when, in the appropriate manner. Privileged information. But look, it was a difficult election. There were, of course, claims and counterclaims of irregularities in different parts of the country. It was particularly challenging in terms of Zanzibar, the Zanzibar elections. And I think it would be, you can't pretend otherwise. It was a difficult election. I think the important thing is that Tanzania has moved on from that period. However difficult and however much controversy was stirred by those elections, Tanzania now is in a different place. There's new leadership. And everyone now is focusing on the upcoming elections, rightly so. And I think the key point I would say in reply to your question is, the test for Tanzanians will be, have the lessons of 2020 been learned, and will they be implemented in the upcoming elections? So the people of Tanzania will get to see for themselves, and I think many of them will be reserving, their judgment until, they've gone through the next elections, and at that point they will come to a more final view, I think, on, what progress has been made since 2020.
Okay, just to talk a little bit further about the elections, because democracy is very important, especially to a developing country like Tanzania. Later this year, we'll be having the civic polls, and in 2025, we'll be having the general election. What do you think Tanzania needs to do now as we prepare for the civic polls this year and then the general election next year? You talked about some of the lessons that we ought to have learned from the 2020 election. As an observer, unfortunately you won't be around during the time, but your successor will be here. What do you think should Tanzania's government prioritize in terms of ensuring that there is free and fair elections this time around?
Well, look, I think that the electoral commissions and the people involved in elections know what to prioritise. And they have all the information in front of them, and they know what their procedures are. I think ensuring as smooth as possible registration of voters is always important, and that's an ongoing process. So that's the first thing that countries and governments and electoral commissions all the world over need to get, which is voter registration. I think beyond that. Doing what the Electoral Commission, should perform in the way that the government and the new legislation says, in the way that it specifies. So people will be wanting to observe that. They know the legislation was enacted earlier this year on Electoral Commission reform and political party reform. So I think the test will be, do the people of Tanzania think that once the elections are underway, that those procedures and those commitments are actually being implemented. All of this is for the institutions of Tanzania to get right, and for the people of Tanzania to participate in, and for the people of Tanzania ultimately to be the ones that judge the process afterwards.
Okay. 7 months into your role as the British High Commissioner, Tanzania unfortunately was dealt a heavy blow. We lost a sitting president, that is the late former President John Magufuli. We all understand how the economic performance, how the diplomatic relations between Tanzania and its neighboring countries, between Tanzania and the international community was at the time. 7 months into your role, you're still trying to get familiar with the environment, and then the head of state dies. Can you just take us through that moment as an ally of Tanzania? You are representing the British interest in the country. What was that moment like for you, and how did it impact your service?
Well, it was a shock. It was first and foremost a tragedy for the friends, family, and close associates of the president, first and foremost. But it was also a shock to the nation. So it was both a sort of private and family loss, but also a very, public event as well. I spent a bit of time with President Magufuli in January 2021. We spent some hours together in Bukoba, inaugurating a new school, which had been partly supported by UK aid. I would never have imagined then, in fact, couldn't have imagined then, that 2 months later I would be attending his state funeral in Dodoma. So it was a shock. Nobody really saw it coming or expected it. As a diplomat, I was aware that, the death in office of a sitting president in Tanzania was unprecedented. So you've never gone through this in your history since independence. And so therefore it would be a test of the country's constitutional system and its institutions. And the question was, would power be transferred? Would there be a smooth transition of power in what was an unprecedented event? And there was. So what we saw is that the constitutional system and the associated institutions of Tanzania were equal to that challenge. And the Tanzania emerged united. And I have to say, seeing Tanzania go through what was a profound moment of loss and uncertainty, and go through that moment and come out the other side united, left a lasting and positive impression on me, albeit in the midst of this tragic loss of the president. So those are my reflections. What happened then, of course, was that we really wanted to, all the diplomats in Tanzania were keen both to mark in the appropriate manner the passing of President Magufuli, and to accord him and his family all due respect. But then, relatively quickly to try and understand the new leadership, President Samir, and whether she would be doing things differently, and if so, how we could support her. That's how I look back on it. Okay,
now we all know that Magufuli's approach when it came to leadership is a far contrast from the current administration under President Samir. When Samir came into power, there was a lot of talk about trying to transform, trying to change Tanzania's diplomatic image, but also on the economic scale, we then started what is known as economic diplomacy. I want you to candidly tell us how the relations were between Tanzania and the British government, British investors, under President Magufuli, and the transformations that were necessitated by the administration that came after his passing. What were the relations between the two countries, with these two administrations? Because you had the privilege of working with Magufuli, but also working with President Samir.
So I think during the Magufuli tenure before I arrived, but also partly when I was here, there were tensions between the whole of the business community in Tanzania, the private sector, if you like, and the government administration at that time. I actually think that by the time I arrived, those tensions were beginning to ease a little. And it's, interesting to speculate, and it is only speculation, what would have emerged during had President Magufuli had a full second term. Nevertheless, it has to be said that there were some really difficult moments during that presidency, the Magufuli presidency, in terms of the government's relationship with the private sector, including foreign investors and international businesses. Now, and a lot of those focused around tax and whether the companies and businesses and investors were really paying the appropriate amount of tax, and were they really disclosing appropriate levels of profits and so on. And I think there were real issues there that needed sorting out. So I think by the time President Samir came to office, things were already beginning to move in a somewhat more positive direction. Of course, when President Samir came into office, one of the very first kind of things she said policy-wise was, I want to see the economy grow, and I want to see businesses thrive, and I want to see more investment, and I want to see more foreign investment. So very early on in her tenure, she switched the tone around the government's relationship with the private sector. But I think it's not right to caricature the Magufuli presidency as being entirely and comprehensively against business, because I don't think it was. I think there were real tensions, and there were big moments of difficulties. But there probably were issues that needed to be sorted out, and there were businesses that got into trouble, but there were also businesses that came through those years managing to continue to do businesses and do well. So I think we have to nuance our commentary around the presidency of Magufuli and the relationship that the government had at the time with business.
Yeah, so David, now the year 2020 was marked with a lot of changes globally. We saw the global shocks of COVID-19, and then later on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but also Brexit. Now, there was a lot that the world had to deal with. And this directly not only impacted the Western world, but also it had an adverse impact on Tanzania and Africa in general. Can you tell us how this particularly impacted the relations between Britain and Tanzania? Because during that entire COVID-19, there was the issue about the vaccines, and now, the global south was seen as a continent that was unfairly treated when it came to access of these vaccines. But beyond that, on the economic scale as well, there was a lot of impact. Can you tell us how that entire shock affected the relations between British and Tanzania?
Yeah, and it was an extraordinary period. And just on the pandemic, I'll start with the pandemic and COVID-19. I arrived in 2020, as you say. At that point, I have to say that the government's policy, if you like, on COVID-19 here was a difficult one. It was a difficult one for friends and partners, international partners of Tanzania, who very much wanted to step up and lean in and cooperate with Tanzania on COVID-19, but were facing real difficulties on that because of the way in which COVID-19 was being handled policy-wise in Tanzania. An opening to change that did emerge, of course, very early on in the tenure of President Samir. She did a very rapid turnaround in terms of the policy on COVID-19, and that enabled partners and friends like the UK and the international institutions, the multilateral institutions, WHO, Gavi, the Global Vaccine Alliance, and so on, to step up, and we did. So if you actually look at what happened in 2021 and through to sort of mid-2022, there was this huge increase in cooperation engagement between countries like the UK, those institutions, and Tanzania, which did result in vaccines being delivered to Tanzania. Okay, those vaccines didn't arrive. By that time, vaccines were already being widely administered in countries like the UK, so there was a lag. But remember that part of that lag was down to the Tanzania's own policy for a period of time. Once that policy changed, as it did, we were able to step up, and the COVAX COVID vaccine scheme did actually start delivering vaccines to Tanzania. I mean, the UK, our High Commissioner here, we engaged very specifically with the Ministry of Health on public health outreach. And we provided technical support to the ministry and its agencies to enable them to get the communications to be as effective as possible with the public. Because, of course, you had a period when the public was being told vaccines are dangerous, COVID is not what you think it is. And then suddenly they're being told, actually, maybe the vaccines are what we all need. So there was quite a big educational program that needed to be completed there. And we did support the Ministry of Health on that. What we learned from that pandemic is just the importance, I think, of having good, strong partnerships with countries on the issues of health security, infectious disease surveillance, health cooperation, public health, outbreak response systems, and so on and so forth. And actually, as a result of all of that, we signed an MOU agreement with the Ministry of Health to put the UK's healthcare and infectious disease cooperation with Tanzania on a much more systematic footing. So we've now got an MOU and an agreement which underlines and covers all of those sorts of areas of cooperation. So I think that if there's another pandemic, and the experts, of course, say that there will be a pandemic at some point, I think the UK and Tanzania will be in a stronger position as partners to be able to work even better next time round. You mentioned the Ukraine situation, which was another, if you like, second of the major global shocks. I mean, it was and it remains a flagrant violation of Ukraine's sovereignty, and it absolutely right then and now that countries like the UK, but countries across Europe and beyond, continue to support Ukraine in its bid to repel the Russian invasion. What we learned at the same time was we learned how interconnected the world is. And we saw in Africa, including in Tanzania, the impacts of the Russia's invasion on, food prices, energy prices, the price of fertilizer. Very few people knew just how much fertilizer was being sold into and traded into Africa, from countries like Ukraine, and how dependent some countries were on grains and food exports from Ukraine before the crisis. We do know now. I think, again, one of our responses has been, the positive that has emerged from this is we've stepped up our cooperation and partnership with Tanzania on issues like food security, on issues like diversification of, economic import and export dependencies. And that work continues, and that cooperation, again, will stand us and Tanzania as partners in good stead as and when there are further global shocks of this kind. These major conflicts, when they happen, what we've learned is that they have effects across the world, including economic and social effects, and we have to build up our systems of resilience in a whole variety of ways. There's more work to do in that space, but I think we have stepped up. Food security now in Africa is a much bigger issue now than it was before the Ukraine-Russia crisis.
Okay, now you talked about the diversification of trade between the UK and Tanzania. Trade is an important factor in the bilateral relations between the two countries. It has grown over the years, which is a positive trend. However, the reliance on Tanzania accessing finished, goods, the modern machinery, and what we export to, to Europe and the UK in particular, there seems to be a vast trade imbalance. And oftentimes we talk about how can Tanzania reach a stage where we export finished goods, where we export value-added goods? What is the trajectory as we're seeing this trade increase over the years? How do we ensure that there is trimming of the trade imbalance so that in volume and value as well, so that we're able to export more valuable goods to markets like the UK?
This is a really important issue because it speaks to one of the biggest challenges that many countries in Africa face, which is how to generate employment and jobs, particularly for youth. And, digging things out of the ground and selling them as sort of unprocessed commodities brings in foreign exchange, but it doesn't necessarily generate many jobs. And so there is a big task ahead for many countries in Africa, Tanzania included, in building up those economic sectors that can actually generate the jobs. I mean, one of those is tourism, which is doing very well in Tanzania. There's been a really positive bounce back from the COVID period, and that's really good to see. And then actually the UK is contributing to that with there's now trade in tourism services, positive trade from Tanzania to the UK of something like $200 million a year, which is a good contribution. But ultimately, Tanzania and other countries will need to move up the value chain, do more in manufacturing and more in those sectors that can generate jobs for youth. Okay, so how to do that? If there was a simple answer to this, it would already have been done. If it was easy, it would have happened. So I think we know it's difficult and we know it's challenging, but it's not insurmountable. So what are the kinds of things that would help? Well, look, one of them is, often when you get into this topic, people say, well, why can't the UK accept more exports from Tanzania? Why don't you open your market? Actually, I'm going to start from the other perspective, the other end of the telescope, if you like, which is what's happening here in Tanzania. In my 4 years here, I've spoken to a lot of businesses, Tanzanian, invested and owned, as well as international. And what I hear repeatedly is that many of them would like to export finished goods, but they're struggling to get a market for what they produce, even here in Tanzania, because they're finding it difficult to compete here with imported finished goods, which are often undercutting them or coming in more cheaply. There's something about the policy environment here in Tanzania on the trade front, which does not favour domestic manufacturers and production, but is more favourable to importers and people bringing goods in from the outside. There's also an issue around some actors evading customs duty. So you've got some goods coming in. Apparently, people believe in large volumes in some cases without paying the appropriate customs duty and the duties on them, which means they're reaching the market stalls around the country at very, very low prices. So domestic manufacturers and producers struggle to compete with those imports. If as a business you can't develop a domestic home market for your goods, you will struggle to develop markets overseas. So step one is, I think, rebalance things in Tanzania to make it easier and more favourable for manufacturers and producers here to trade and sell in Tanzania. Step two is about trade within Africa. One of the, as you well know, I mean, one of the things that holds Africa back economically is the relatively low level of trade within Africa. And there are historical, reasons for that, with a lot of the investment historically, including during colonial period, being around the coast ports so that extracted, so that minerals and other natural products could be shipped out. So that, and that's left Africa with a shortage of infrastructure to connect African countries across the continent. So that's part of the problem, the sort of legacy, the historical legacy. But it's an issue that needs to be fixed if jobs for youth in Africa are to be created. We, the UK, have been working very strongly with an NGO called Trademark Africa, many years, to support the development of infrastructure, both hard and soft, that will facilitate cross-border trade, both in East Africa and beyond. And I think that cooperation, that work, includes obviously with the Tanzanian government, has borne fruit. We've now got border trading posts and border infrastructure which enables goods to move much faster across borders. That's a good start. But there's more to do in that space. But getting trade flowing across Africa and within Africa would then expand the markets for these goods within Africa. Expanding your market means you can produce things at scale, which reduces your costs, which means that you then stand a much better chance in the wider global export market arena.
Okay. So it's interesting that you've raised that point, that what really limits, what inhibits the growth of trade for Tanzania and many African countries is by and large inherently within the governments. Now, what exactly is being done? Because you're within the corridors of, you engage with some of the decision makers, you invest billions here in Tanzania, but then you're aware that even as you invest, to support a certain infrastructural project, at the end of the day, there are these policy issues that limit Tanzania benefiting or sustaining that development on their own. Do you think, as a development partner, it would be in the best interest of you as an ally of Tanzania and also the Tanzanian government to ensure that there are internal policies by the government that actually benefit Tanzanian traders, Tanzania entrepreneurs, instead of the government relying on aid, relying on support from the British government and any other development partner. But then at the end of the day, we're still working with the same policies that inhibit our trade.
So I think, there are many excellent experts within the Tanzanian government who know this area far better than me, and they're onto this. This week in Tanzania, a new national trade policy was launched, and I very much hope that will achieve something of a rebalancing that will enable those Tanzanian businesses that are in the business of producing goods, particularly finished goods, and agro-processing companies that are adding value to agricultural products, to be able to compete more effectively in Tanzania and in Africa for markets, and then make the step out to expand and export beyond Africa. It's doable. That would, you're quite right, help Tanzania to be less dependent on foreign aid. I think Tanzania is already a lot less dependent on foreign aid than it was. Tanzania, if you look at its relationship now with development partners, is very different to how it was 15, even 10 years ago. Today, as a development partner, with Tanzania, we are working in partnership on technical assistance for systems reform, technical assistance in relation to how you expand your tax base, technical assistance in the policy space. We are not doing the kinds of things that perhaps donors used to do, which was step in and do things that the government should be doing for its own citizens anyway. We're increasingly not in that space anymore. So I think overall Tanzania is much less dependent on foreign aid and moving the right direction. And it is making very good use of concessional loans from organisations like the World Bank. It is making very good use of organisations like the IMF. But ultimately it's in control of its own agenda. And that's right. And it is making the decisions on its terms about, what kinds of loans it wants, how much sovereign debt it wants to take on, and what it wants to allocate that capital for. And all of that's right, because Tanzania needs to function as its own sovereign state, making its own sovereign decisions. The direction of travel, I think, is positive. I think where an injection of and a scaling up of foreign direct investment and an expansion of businesses in those parts of the economy that can create jobs and goods and products higher up the value chain, that will then enable Tanzania to go to the next level. And not only be, much less, increasingly, not dependent on aid, but actually have a thriving, be seen to be having a thriving economy. It needs to still continue to look, in my view, at the business environment. It's very focused on that at the moment, and that's good. There's still some work to be done on the business environment to make the business environment work for producers, for manufacturers, and to make it genuinely competitive and attractive for foreign direct investment. Tanzania is competing with its neighbours for foreign direct investment. I think there's an increasing awareness of that now. I think Tanzania is very well placed to compete very successfully in the future. There are one or two adjustments that may be required in the business environment to make that possible. One of those is tax. And we've already seen the presidents this week announce a new review of the tax system. That is very welcome, very timely, and is absolutely spot on. The one thing that most businesses will talk to you about as an ambassador or diplomat here is that their problems that they have with tax.
Yeah, exactly. And speaking about taxes, we understand that ambassadors in Tanzania had sent a letter to the Foreign Affairs Ministry when there was that kerfuffle regarding the tax administration, how the Tanzania Revenue Authority collects its taxes, how they engage with investors, be it local or foreign investors. What were the major concerns from the UK perspective, because you serve the interests of the UK community here in Tanzania, including the business community? What were the major concerns when it came to taxes here in Tanzania, and what do you expect this commission that has been lined up by the president will address? What are your major expectations, and what were the major concerns?
Yeah, so let me start by saying, first of all, I believe we have had and will continue to have a positive relationship with the government on tax. So we have been very proactively encouraging foreign direct investment into Tanzania. Secondly, we're working through technical assistance with organisations like the Tanzanian Tax Authorities, TRA, to enable them to have access to the best knowledge and information from around the world on how you broaden and expand your tax base, how you encourage more people across the economy to come into the formal economy and pay taxes. So we have a very positive relationship in the policy space, and I want to say that first of all. We also have, some of the biggest taxpayers in Tanzania are British invested businesses. And they are keen to pay tax. They pay tax. They pay it honestly. They're keen to pay tax. And they, all they ask in return is for a fair deal and transparency and predictability from the tax system. They are not looking to avoid paying tax. They're not looking to pay less tax. They just want a fair deal, and they want the tax system to be as transparent and clear and simplified as possible. Now, on the recent letter, so what's happened in the last few months is a return, if you like, to some of the practices on tax that we saw in the previous government, the fifth phase government. And so those include things like businesses being confronted with a tax bill for large amounts of money, but without any evidence or explanation of why they owe that money, then given very short deadlines on how to respond, then in some cases being subject to these agency notices which lead to bank accounts being frozen and so on. So it's not just UK invested businesses that have had that experience, it's Tanzanian businesses, it's across the board. So it's the entire private sector that has had that experience. And it's a trend that's been seen, across recent months, and it sort of reached a point where embassies, including the UK High Commission, thought we're hearing so much from our businesses, but actually I was also hearing it from Tanzanian businesses. Well, it's time that we wrote to express our concern about this, but we wanted to do it in a constructive way, and we wanted to put it in a positive frame, which is we can see positive developments in the business environment. We very much want to encourage foreign direct investment. We're on your side, but there are some issues with tax, the way tax is being handled, that you need to be aware of. And we want to work with you as much as we can to address those concerns in a positive, constructive way. So we weren't writing to just list a whole mass of complaints, and it wasn't designed to embarrass the government. It was genuinely intended to be constructive, whilst at the same time drawing attention to what we believed were some genuinely important concerns, both for Tanzanian businesses actually, but also foreign businesses. We intended it to be a private letter. It made its way into the public domain. So now everyone, including journalists such as yourself, are aware of it. But as I said, the president has responded, not necessarily specifically to that letter, but she responded to the full range of concerns, I think in a constructive way. And she has, commissioned a review of the tax system, which is, as I said before, is very, very welcome.
Okay, now, David, the UK Minister for Africa, Lord Collins of Highbury, recently talked about how he's going to work more closely with Africa. Now, we know that Africa is now a continent that has one of the world's fastest growing economies. Innovation is on the rise. Now, can you tell us, now, as the British government, when it comes to engaging with Tanzania, when it comes to engaging with Africa under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, what is the policy approach?
Thank you. So we have a new government in the UK. So and there is now will be a process where on Africa and on other issues, the new government looks at the policies and approach and rightly asks, are there things we need to do differently, improve? There has been for many years and will continue to be a strong sense of the increasing global importance and significance of African countries, in the sense that across Africa, you've got some of the fastest growing economies in the world. That will continue to be the case. Now, in some cases, that economic growth isn't yet delivering the jobs and the reductions in poverty and so on that many African populations want to see, but there is headline growth to work with and to work from in terms of moving countries forward in those areas. The second sort of point of real awareness is the global demographics. So the world as a whole, in many parts of the world, you've at a point where populations are aging fast, and working age populations in many parts of the world are beginning to reduce. That's the case in China. It isn't quite the case yet in India, but it soon will be. The one part of the world where that isn't the case, clearly, is Africa, sub-Saharan African countries. You've still got rapidly growing populations, and the working age populations of many African countries is still growing. I read a statistic recently which suggests that, in fact, most of the global growth in the global working age population over the next couple of decades, most of that will be in Africa. Nearly all of it may end up being in Africa. So the UK and others are very exercised by this idea that what happens in Africa economically is vital for Africa, but it's also going to be important globally. And if Africa succeeds in economic transformation, generating jobs for growth, that will deliver huge benefit for Africa, but it will also be globally significant. And that therefore a country like the UK needs to be getting alongside that agenda, working closely with countries like Tanzania and saying, look, what can we offer you? What can we do with you that will help you take your positive headline growth, and Tanzania's been growing well, 6%, whatever, for many years on average, to take that headline growth and translate that into jobs, improved livelihoods, better healthcare, increased access to education, and so on and so forth. What can we do with you that will help in that area? Because we want what you want. We know that the government of Tanzania, the people of Tanzania, want all those things. They want jobs, they want better healthcare, they want education, and so on. And they've got the headline growth. So how to connect the two and how to make one support and transform the other. So all of those things are very strategic. And some of that economic transformation requires more infrastructure. Some of it requires different business environment policies. Some of it requires, a different approach to tax, whatever. But across all of those, there's potential for partnership between a country like the UK and Africa. Now, the challenge is that in some parts of Africa, and it's only in some parts, you've got conflicts and you've got crisis situations which can have the effect of drawing all the attention to those spots, and putting a lot of emphasis on sort of crisis response, providing peacekeeping support, providing humanitarian support for populations caught up in conflict. So, as a development partner, as a friend of Africa, it's important that you can provide that support, humanitarian support and crisis support, but equally but not at the expense of being alongside countries on that slower, steadier journey of economic transformation. So so the challenge with, I think, with engaging Africa for a country like the UK is how to do the immediately urgent, the life-saving, the humanitarian, the crisis response support and partnership, but also be there on the longer-term strategic issues around economic transformation. I'm really sure that whatever comes out of the UK government's review on Africa, that you will see both of those aspects covered.
Okay. So now, under the current administration, under President Samia Suluhu Hassan, there's been a lot of reform, a lot of restructuring of the cabinet. In the Foreign Affairs Ministry, since you came into office as the British High Commissioner, there have been 4 Foreign Affairs Ministers. From Liberata Mulamula, we had Stagomena Tax, we had January Makamba, and right now there's Mahmoud Kombo. You have worked with all of these 4 Foreign Affairs Ministers. Can you tell us, how does that impact the way you work with the Tanzanian government, the way you work with the ministry? Is there any adverse impact in terms of implementation of projects whenever there is this constant, frequent reshuffle of heads of ministries?
Actually, I've worked with 5 foreign ministers because Professor Kabudi was the foreign minister when I first arrived. But I take your point. Look, each of those 5 foreign ministers has, in my view, behaved with great professional courtesy. Each of them has been willing to talk to me about and discuss with me the issues of the day and the bilateral relationship. With all of them, I felt it was possible to raise concerns, but also listen to their concerns in terms of what's going on in the bilateral relationship and beyond. Of course, each new person in a role will bring their own personal style, and I think 5 foreign ministers, 5 different personal styles. I have yet to meet my 5th foreign minister. I will do so next week. I have met him previously, but not in this current role. But actually, what I reflected on this issue just in the last couple of days, actually, and I was thinking, and the conclusion I drew was that there's been a remarkable amount of continuity. So since President Samia came into office, the theme for the foreign ministry has been economic diplomacy, and that hasn't changed. So whoever was in that job continued with that as the top priority and the main priority. So and actually, nor have many of the other priorities shifted dramatically. So policies towards international organisations, the position with respect to how Tanzania votes in the UN General Assembly on the Russia-Ukraine conflict. None of that has changed. There's been a lot of continuity on that. So we haven't felt, and I haven't felt, that our programme of cooperation has been disrupted. What has been required is, of course, with each new foreign minister, ensuring that you have some time to talk to them about the bilateral relationship and explain the various cooperation programs that are going on so that they understand. So each new minister coming into that role, obviously there's a period of time where they need to understand what Tanzania is doing with all of these various partner countries. So there's a steep learning curve early on for new ministers. I like to think that we've been helpful in enabling new ministers to very quickly get up to speed on the UK-Tanzania relationship.
Okay, so you've engaged with the opposition party here in Tanzania. As we mentioned earlier, we're in an election season, the civic polls and then the general election. You met with Sebu from the ACT Wazalendo. I want to get your view in terms of the democratic reforms that have happened over the years, but also you've been an active supporter of press freedom. You've engaged with the media fraternity in Tanzania. There have been a lot of grievances over the years when it came to the regulatory aspect of things. What is your view about the democratic reforms, but also press freedom as we move forward?
Really important issues, complex issues, wherever you are in the world, the issues of democracy, how institutions run, how electoral commissions run, how parties relate to one another, and how the media works. And this is complicated and complex and challenging everywhere. I do think there's been a lot of progress in Tanzania. When President Samia came in, a number of things changed. The ability for political parties to hold rallies outside of campaign periods changed. That made a huge difference. So, suddenly Tanzanians were able to feel that, if they did support one of the other parties, that this was something they could express, and this was something that they could, sort of express by joining a rally that's being held. That's got to be a positive step. Dialogue between the parties in relation to what kinds of electoral reforms would be helpful, what kinds of further institutional changes would help the progress of democracy. So that took off when Samia, came into office, and that too was positive. And then the issues around Zanzibar. The election in 2020 there, as we said before, was particularly challenging, particularly difficult. There were a lot of grievances that came out of that election. That process of addressing those grievances is still underway, and that journey has yet to finish, but some progress has been made. The most obvious example of that was the decision or agreement to form the Government of National Unity. I, very early on, had the privilege of meeting Maalim Seif on Zanzibar shortly after the 2020 elections. And so I talked to him about his ideas and what he felt what he felt would be best for Zanzibar's interests, given what had happened in the elections. And I came in over a very short period of time of getting to meet him, to hold a lot of respect for his approach, particularly in relation to reconciliation. Sadly, we lost him to COVID in the midst of all of that. But I do think that his legacy of the Government of National Union was made the best of a very difficult situation for Zanzibaris. Okay, the test of all of that for most Tanzanians will be what happens in the civic elections and then the general election, national elections next year. So, in a sense, the jury is out on the success of all of that for Tanzanians. And I come back to this point, it's not for a country like the UK to judge any of this, it's for Tanzanians, people of Tanzania, the civil society and the organisations of Tanzania to reach their conclusions about the success and the degree of progress that's really been made on democratisation. The media, again, progress has been made. One of President Samia's early acts was to allow a number of media outlets that have been effectively closed off or banned to get their licenses back so that they could start engaging again. And we have seen, I think, when I look at the media now, compared with when I first arrived, I do see more evidence of a wider range of commentary and analysis on a wider range of topics, including analysis that is critical of government policy. I see that particularly in the economic space, including, in Citizen. I would hold out as a good example of that. Just this week, Citizen newspaper had an editorial which was pretty critical of tax administration and tax policy. I would not have seen that kind of editorial 4 years ago when I first arrived in Tanzania. So I think that's just one piece of an anecdotal piece of evidence, but I think it's indicative of a trend towards there being more scope for more critical analysis of policy issue, particularly in the economic and business space, and that has to be a positive thing. Of course, as I said, the test will be national elections. How do the media engage? Are they allowed to report, freely on events? And I very much hope that they are. And I think it's at that point that we will all have, including the people of Tanzania, a better sense of, the extent of the progress that's been made.
Okay, so as we're almost concluding, Marion Young has been appointed as the incoming British High Commissioner. You have spent 4 years here in Tanzania, so you know the country in and out from the political perspective, socio-economic. What is your message to your successor?
Tanzania is a wonderful country. People are wonderful. It's a beautiful country. It's got a real role to play in the development and growth of Africa, and is one of those countries that I believe is going to be up there with among the most important sub-Saharan African countries in years to come. So my message to her is, it's a privilege to serve here. Make the most of it.
Okay, well, David, on that note, it's been a pleasure talking to you. You were with me, Mpogi Thompson, for the Citizen Exclusive. It's a wrap for this episode. Until next time, bye-bye.